few days ago, a student stopped me to tell me proudly that he'd had a paper accepted for a conference. I knew it was my best stuff, he told me. I wrote it for a class from Kim Johnson. So I asked him what it is about Kim that enables her to bring out the very best in our students. And he thought for a second. He said, she's draconian. But in a good way. He said, so Draco Draconis in the good sense. The English department has a dragon in residence. And Kim is a dragon in the good sense. The kind of teacher, poet, and scholar that you hear myths about, that you dream of meeting someday, but that you rarely actually find in universities. No one in this department before Kim has won a Guggenheim, I'm sure. Students repeatedly call her the best of mentors. Her poetry can persuade you that she is possessed of a deep wisdom beyond mere human experience. In that poetry, she's a creature of the elements, of the rocks and the air. And the hoard where she lives is a word hoard. And when she unlocks her word hoard, she writes some of the best poetry that's being written today. Poetry that is inquisitive, demanding, exact, surprising. And she pulls the same kind of surprises out of her mentors, the poets whom she studies as a scholar. Herbert, Donne, Taylor, Crashaw, even Herrick. She'll tell you that her proudest work is parenting Elisha and Bennett, but she produces books as well. In addition to her volumes of poetry, A Metaphorical God, and before that, Leviathan with a Hook, and the forthcoming Uncommon Prayer. She's edited a collection of essays, scholarly essays on the metaphysical poets, and with Jay Hopler, edited a collection called Before the Door of God, a collection of devotional poetry. And you've got to look up the Georgics, her translation. Last night I was looking for it online, and it popped up on Amazon as The Georgics by Virgil and Kimberly Johnson. Well, her newest book, Made Flesh, Sacrament and Poetics in Post-Reformation England, pays attention to how poems work. Can a poem, like a sip of sacramental wine, not just commemorate Christ's sacrifice, but can a poem, like a communion wafer, resolutely be a piece of matter and still evoke God's presence? Of course not. How could it? But does it? Can bread become fire? Listen to Kim. Here be dragons, in the good sense.
I told Kristen Matthews that I'd give her $20 if she'd do her opening prayer in a limerick form. And she has left it up here for me. With the last line, I ran out of time. So I will give her $17. Okay, so this is my first ever PowerPoint that is not just one thing. So I'm going to try and do both things at the same time. Okay. The World Made Flesh, Poetry, Meaning, Materiality. Thank you all for coming today, and to everybody who did so much work to make this happen. Okay. Everyone awake now? As some of you know, before I was a literature person, I did this for a while. I worked and taught in an anatomy lab and spent my days dissecting cadavers, taking the scalpel in my hand and pressing down through layers of skin, down to the adipose tissue underneath, down to the bones and their elastic tendons, down to the organs and the macrame of nerves that connected them all together. I loved this work. I loved the operational systems that were revealed and the way that each system made sense both on its own and in the context of other systems. How the lungs, right there, took their texture from the millions of tiny alveoli that made them up, each one a microscopic air sac that transmitted oxygen to an equally microscopic network of capillaries that were connected to larger capillaries, and then to tiny venules and larger venules, and on up to the pulmonary artery, which rushed all that oxygen to the heart to be pumped to, well, everywhere else. I loved the way that my scalpel revealed not that the cool and significant stuff was under the surface, but that it was indistinguishable from the surface, that everything was significant. Every cell contributed, every fiber played a part. I wrote a poem based on my experiences in the anatomy lab, though I stole my title from another field. Robert Burton wrote The Anatomy of Melancholy in 1621. See the different allegorical figures for the kinds of melancholy here? On the upper right, you have solitudo. The left of the title, you have inamorato, enamored melancholy. On the right of the title, hypochondriacus, and the praying figure down below, superstitio, down on the left. In this magisterial multi-volume tome, Burton endeavors to categorize, define, and explain all the kinds of melancholy that a person might experience, from the melancholy of covetousness to the melancholy of thwarted ambition, from love melancholy to religious melancholy. It's an exhaustive accounting, and along the course of the anatomy of melancholy, Burton bumps up against a vastness of topics that include digestion, the topography of the still new to Europeans American continent, erotic poetry, and goblins, among other points of interest. Still, as I have often said at readings when I introduced this poem, I think he missed this one. The melancholy of anatomy. One white bucket of hearts, their brown chambers visible and raw. One bucket of wombs, one mazed with guts, one heavy with wet lungs, and one full of hands, like a reception, silent and amiable, tenderly dissected to show each muscle's posture, the mechanics of bone and white tendon. White-coated the anatomist works scalpel and pick, unbreathing, coaxing the layers apart, epidermis from dermis, adipose, translucent fascia. The anatomist never looks up, tries never to think on the lab's humane piecework, not that the scene's too gruesome, but too stately. In its bloodless displays, no remembrance of the messy, blessed animal. To prepare the practical exam, the anatomist pins a suite of specimens with alphabetic tags, which arranged on the white table will spell something mournful, something unutterable. Contrary to appearances, my point here is not, in fact, to seize any excuse to read my own work, but rather to make connections between the work of the anatomist and the work of the poet and the work of the literary scholar. The experience that this poem describes has everything to do with the process by which we come to understand a thing, by digging in and rooting around, but realizes that our efforts to understand sometimes find us separating the pieces from the world, from the urgent messiness of living. There is experiential as well as intellectual meaning to be found in the little stuff, though it would seem to flout the understanding. Nevertheless, the very act of engaging, of perceiving and experiencing provides its own kind of meaningfulness that is not identical with its interpretation, but precedes it. We are, all of us here, professional spellers, and in spelling the word and the world, we seek to make it comprehensible. And as professional spellers, we may find ourselves a bit melancholy when we are confronted with the object that requires no spelling, whose meaningfulness is coterminous with its being. But it is the quality of its resistant objecthood that draws me to poetry as a reader and as a writer, that drew me to poetry in the first place as a viable alternative seduction to the squishy and slimy and manifestly material glories of the anatomy lab. For the thingness of a poem, which I'm inclined to call its pleromic ontology, makes an artifact of language, an object that invites contemplation and consideration in its own right, and not merely as a transparent pointer towards some endlessly deferred elsewhere. In ways I hope to tease out over the next several minutes, poetry insists upon the materializing capacities of language, Poetry is the word made flesh, a condition simultaneous to its being, by a felicitous addition, the world made flesh. I'd like to take a few minutes to perform what some would consider to be an unholy marriage, a bald defiance of our hallowed proclamation on the fields between 17th century poet George Herbert and 21st century avant-garde poet and poetic theorist Charles Bernstein. Though the material of his critical interest is some centuries removed from early modern England, Bernstein provides a perspective on the interpretive effects of formally inventive poetry that offers crucial insight into the work of George Herbert and many other poets. Bernstein's analysis of the way that experimental postmodern poetry, that is, writing of the school that Bernstein and his aesthetic peers term language poetry, the way that this poetry foregrounds its own material presence offers an approach that I will offer here helps us to understand, among others, the representational stakes of George Herbert's innovative lyric forms in the temple, as well as illuminating the materializing functionalities that animate my own work as a scholar and a poet. The poem that we encounter on the page, argues Bernstein, is the visible sign of writing. This is a longer quote. Is the visible sign of writing, but reading, insofar as it consumes and absorbs the mark, erases it. The words disappear in what we might call the transparency effect and are replaced by that which they depict, their meaning. And he has meaning in scare quotes. So words yield their meaning in that familiar dance of sign and signified about which we enlightened postmodernists have been so long jaded. But Bernstein continues, quote, anti-absorptive writing recuperates the mark by making it opaque. That is, by maintaining its visibility and undermining its meaning, where meaning, once again in scare quotes, is understood in the narrower utilitarian sense of a restricted economy. As writing foregrounds more strenuously the non-denotative qualities of its language, Bernstein explains, it increasingly resists what he calls the transparency effect. Such writing must be negotiated not merely as a set of referential signs, but as an object as such, which status confers presence rather than implying absence. That is, particularly here, the absence of the signified. As Bernstein says, expanding this point, the visibility of words as a precondition of reading necessitates that words obtrude impermeably into the world. The thickness of words ensures that whatever of their physicality is erased or engulfed in the process of semantic projection, a residue tenaciously adheres that will not be sublimated away. So in other words, those non-denotative features of poetic language, poetry's emphasis on sound and recurrent structures, its visual layout and strategic deployments of spacing, its interruptive and suspensive lineation, its maintenance of pattern both in and out of grammar and syntax, these features interpose themselves into the referential function of language. And the more ostentatious the poem's poetic devices, the less referentially transparent it becomes. Think back to the first time you ever read Gerard Manley Hopkins and tell me if you did much more that day than just absorb the sound. Moreover, as Bernstein goes on to suggest, as poetic utterance both invites an encounter with semantic absorption and frustrates that encounter by means of its opaque objecthood, the intersection of those registers of textual experience is, and these are Bernstein's terms, is precisely flesh. Bernstein observes acutely that in its anti-absorptive qualities, poetry enlists the body as an experiential instrument. The flesh, thus, is not an obstacle between the reader and the poem. Rather, it is their means of communication. So even though he's anticipating Bernstein by some 400 years, throughout the temple, George Herbert performs a poetics marked by its investment in precisely the kind of objecthood that Bernstein describes, which is to say, a poetics in which the materiality of text tenaciously obtrudes itself into the transparency of semantic projection. The anti-absorptive qualities of Herbert's verse are evident, to be sure, in the extraordinary formal innovation that characterizes the temple. In that book, among other experiments, Herbert used no fewer than 29 different patterns with the simple A-B rhyme scheme. Such formal ingenuity should not be regarded as mere ornamentation or, and I'm looking at you guys here, as a reinforcement of the real meaning of the poem as expressed in its content. Rather, an emphasis on form, on surface, as opaque in Herbert's poetry, demands that we confront that form as such, that we register the material presence of the poem. To recognize Herbert's stake in the objecthood of poems is to get to the heart of Herbert's project. Herbert treats the signifying capacity of form itself most conspicuously, of course, in the altar, in which the shape of the poem's appearance on the page may be said to evoke the sight of the encounter for which it yearns. I'll read this poem because, you gotta read poems. The altar. A broken altar, Lord, thy servant rears, made of a heart and cemented with tears, whose parts are as thy hand did frame, no workman's tool hath touched the same. A heart alone is such a stone as nothing but thy power doth cut. Wherefore each part of my hard heart meets in this frame to praise thy name, that if I chance to hold my peace, these stones to praise thee may not cease. O let thy blessed sacrifice be mine, and sanctify this altar to be thine. While it's undeniable that the shape of the altar relates symbolically to the content of the poem, to view the poem's graphic appearance on the page as if it merely served a referential function, as if it were a means by which we might understand the true meaning of the poem, elides the powerful embodiment that the poem accomplishes into its semantic content. Even beyond the drama of the poem's content, the structure of the altar aggressively asserts its ontological primacy, such that Stanley Fish, who turns immediately and bewildering to the work of discrediting the poem's strident constructedness as, quote, one path Herbert chose not to follow, nevertheless initiates that argument by remarking that, quote, the most notable and noticeable feature of the poem is, of course, its shape. In fact, one might say that the first thing the poem does, even before we take in any of its words, is call attention to itself as something quite carefully made. Even for Stanley Fish, who doesn't believe Herbert chose to think about the constructedness of this poem, says that the first thing that this poem does is advertise its own constructedness as an object, its presence on the page as a physical shape. We need only consult a handful of critical opinions on the poem's shape to grant that the referential ends of this poem's shape remain uncertain. Does it depict a communion table, a classical altar, a Deuteronomic altar of unhewn stones, the pillar, the letter I? Each of these referents has been justified by readers eager to establish what the form means for the content of the poem. But the very referential uncertainty of the shape indicates the ways in which it resists stable representation, even as it projects its own ineffaceable presence as an object. Moreover, the language of the altar explicitly reflects upon the poem's textuality itself as a site of immanence, as when each piece of the broken heart meets in this frame to praise thy name. In self-reflexively implicating the frame of the poem, as well as the larger literary/material frame of the book, The Temple, these lines point toward the architecture of the texts in which they are embedded, and locate conservative efficacy in their objecthood. For the frame of the poem, its graphic presence on the page, and the artifact of the book persist to the perception. They are permanent and materially apprehensible things. By foregrounding, both in its form and in its content, its own textuality, the poem invites an encounter in which the textual is material. Using such formally assertive poetic strategy, the poem insists on itself as a sensible, you can spell this either way, sensible, or in a sense, hyphen able to be sensed, a sensible object. Poetic form in the altar means, which is to say presence as such means. The notion that presence means is, to be sure, particularly relevant to the long early modern debate about the mode of divine presence in the Eucharistic species, in which the signs of bread and wine and the perceptually absent body of Christ have some relationship that's called into question by the evolving theologies of the period. But Herbert's treatment of material presence, intriguingly, avoids engaging the terms of theological disputation, displacing any argument his poem makes about sacramentality into his Poetics. And his Poetics exhibits considerable reluctance to divest the corporeal of significance. I'm particularly interested here in the way that Herbert's poetry makes of the text a kind of presence machine, reifying the material object of the text for its own sake. This emphasis on textual immanence recurs in a poem called Jesu, or Jesu, in which the word for the word, capital W word, excuse me, the name Jesu, is broken into pieces. I probably want to say that I and J are interchangeable in Herbert's Latin-inflected early modern idiom, and though this printing uses J, some use I. So I'll just read this. Jesu. Jesu is in my heart. His sacred name is deeply carved there. But the other week, a great affliction broke the little frame, even all to pieces, which I went to seek. And first I found the corner where was J, and after where ES, and next where U was graved. When I had got these parcels, instantly I sat me down to spell them, and perceived that to my broken heart he was, I ease you, and to my whole is Jesu. This poem's conceit asks us to imagine, as in the altar, that the heart is a quasi-linguistic little frame upon which a variant of the name of Jesus is deeply carved. When the speaker's heart breaks in pieces, the name likewise breaks into its constituent parts. Christ's name is divided into components of sound in which the speaker deciphers lexical units, words, which in turn make up a syntactic unit, I ease you. And yet, even as this narrative of meaning-making plays out in the poem, the word Jesu, or rather the letters that constitute that word, remains separable into units, materially manipulable, like children's wooden blocks with the alphabet painted on them. The heart dissolves irrevocably, and especially in its breaking, into the realm of the metaphoric. But the breakage of the word into letter happens not at some conceptual remove, but before our eyes, on the page. The signifier Jesu, far from allowing transparent access to some divine signified, disintegrates into graphic units, signs that announce themselves as signs, parts that no longer function stably referentially. The term Jesu is repositioned thus from signifier at the poem's beginning to opaque sign. More to the point, the word, capital W, achieves material presence in Jesu not by being referred to, but in the physically perceptible objects of the word, little w. Herbert's poem Lovejoy similarly engages with the question of material textuality, both in its allegorical narrative and in the graphic signs of its poetic presence. The poem foregrounds the tension between referentiality and materiality from its first line. As on a window late I cast mine eye, I saw a vine drop grapes with J and C annealed on every bunch. One standing by asked what it meant. I, who am never loath to spend my judgment, said, it seemed to me to be the body and the letters both of joy and charity. Sir, you have not missed, the man replied. It figures Jesus Christ. The window upon which the speaker gazes advertises the interpretive dynamic of aesthetic media. It presents a material sign that the speaker must contemplate. Here, as in Jesu, the work of identifying appropriate signifieds for signs, in this case the letters J and C, does not compromise their status as signs or their durability as signs, any more than the identity of grapes is compromised by their typological association with Christ. But unlike the visible sign of grapes, which is sensorially apprehensible to the persons in the poem but not to the readers of the poem, the letters J and C persist in their non-transparent graphic materiality beyond the resolution of the poem's interpretive drama, that is, beyond its last line. The poem sustains the material artifacts of its own textuality, emphasizing their matter, as distinct from the spiritual meanings generated by the poem's allegorical interpretations. The poem's investment in the material of its own language redounds to its treatment of the figure of Christ. When the speaker reads the letters J and C as signifying joy and charity, his interlocutor both endorses and corrects that interpretation, saying, it figures Jesus Christ. This statement simultaneously invites and frustrates a consideration of what Jesus Christ, as a set of symbols, means. Does the name of Christ reference the person of Christ, or the principles of joy and charity, or do they imply each other? And how exactly are we to read the word figures here, with its corporeal echoes or as an active metaphor? These conundra foreground interpretation as the central action of the poem, thematizing as they do the problematic referentiality of the visible sign. But even as that interpretive crisis reaches its uncertain resolution in the last line, the capitalized, italicized text, Jesus Christ, emphasizes the wordiness of the word in the John 1:14 sense, the substantial expression of the divine. The conclusion of Lovejoy forces a confrontation with the logos as a sign, one whose presence is ever more reified in the diminishing stability of its signifiers. As we become more certain about how the words Jesus Christ mean, we grow more aware of their presence as words. To put it another way, Christ is more present in this text as a sign than as a signified. Most present not in the poem's transparent referentiality, but in its textual objecthood. Herbert treats poetry as an incarnational mechanism, able to produce literal, substantial presence on the page. Throughout the temple, the aesthetic is rendered as a site of immanence, an instrument by which presence is made possible. In Herbert's prescient language poetics, signs become objects as such, in part because of the poetry's anti-absorptive character. So, back to the present. Herbert's work provides us with a luxurious example of the kind of readerly encounter that poetry produces, I would say in general. But the effects I've been describing here should not be understood as specific to Herbert's era, a precious or quaint vestige from a more formally fastidious period in literature. I would insist rather that as a genre, poetry is distinct for the ways in which it generally emphasizes the communicative properties of its non-denotative features in order to produce a self-aware and objective textuality, a self-affirming textual object. Poetry is a formal practice that is fundamentally invested in the substantiality of its own medium, not only as a mechanism for generating referentiality, narration, mimesis, and other discursive acts, but for its own sake. Indeed, the dynamic and mutually canceling interaction of referentiality and materiality underwrites poetic utterance, as on one hand, the designative function suggests the transparency of the word, while on the other hand, the formal conspicuities of poetic language intrude into that designative function, asserting the word as a sonic, rhythmic, and spatial object. As Mutlu Koenig-Blazing writes, the incommensurability of the semiotic/formal and the semantic/symbolic system is perceivable as an immediate experience in poetic language, for they work at each other's expense. A poem, far from being a text where sound and sense, form and meaning are indissolubly one, is a text where we witness the distinct operation of the two systems. We cannot do both at once, and poetic language will not allow us to ignore either system. As poetry elaborates its devices into the sensorium, it destabilizes the referential function of words, an interplay that keeps hermeneutic attention on the linguistic surface, thwarting interpretive transparency. Patterns of recurrence, what I would call the defining marker of poetry, rely on corporeally available qualities of language, formal schemes using rhyme and alliteration, assonance and consonants, and the alternating and variable stress patterns of meter, among others. These contribute to the semantic meaning of the poem, but they do not themselves constitute semantic meaning. Likewise, the graphic positioning of words on a page, including but not limited to the line breaks that interrupt the horizontal progress of language and activate perceptions of the spatiality of texts, these intrude perceptually into the accumulation of semiotic information. These features introduced a textual substantiality that resists being read through to some stable and defined real meaning or content. Similarly, figurative language emphasizes the estrangement or incommensurability of the terms it links, erupting as difference into the conciliatory urges of meaning-making. In Blazing's terms, these poetic processes work to foreground the mechanism of the code because they present to the apprehension language per se as an artifact of encounter. Alan Grossman's term for the encounter that poetry offers is the presence of presence. When I describe poetry as the world made flesh, I am not trying to suggest something about its capacity to still a deeply felt moment of experience, to crystallize the ephemera of real life forever and ever in the immutable word. Any of my students will attest, some in outrage, that I'm constantly trying to persuade them that poems don't give a rat's sweet patootie about their deep feelings. I'm not trying to be a jerk. That just happens incidentally along the way. But I am trying to reframe their experience of poetry so that they become aware of the way that poetry's power does not consist solely in its utility as a conduit or transmitter, pointing endlessly and perhaps vainly to something else, some other elsewhere that is imagined to be of primary importance. Poetry is not about the forever endeavor to compensate for the shortcomings of our experience. It is not an accessory to the real meaning which exists outside itself. It is not, to return again to the theologically fraught language that not coincidentally populates the conversation surrounding poetics, an accident. Rather, I'm trying to argue for an understanding of poetics that honors the thing for its own substantiality and recognizes that the poem aggressively resists transparence through all the means it can. In perpetually asserting its objecthood, poetry invites the full activation of all our perceptual faculties. And it is here, I think, that all the theological valences of poetic discourse deposit their payload for me. But I'm not going to turn here to the implications that may seem like my obvious destination. I think the parallels between the divine logos as the materially perceptible presence of divinity and the poetic text as the kind of presencing mechanism I've been describing can be more or less intuitive by now. And if they can't, it may require more historical contextualization and footnoting than we have time for here. In fact, someone might need to write a whole book to think it all through. Coming now to a store near you. Instead, what I'd like to consider in conclusion is the ways in which this view of poetry might illuminate a more local set of theological concerns. For me, what's at stake in this approach to poetry is precisely the way it reifies and valorizes the material object, the world at hand. A consideration of poetry as an object suffused with meaningfulness in itself, an artifact that is self-sufficient and not contingent on an external or transcendent term for its own substantiality, must necessarily redound to the status of the material generally. Such a view would train the perceptual faculties to apprehend the object at hand, that chair, that light bulb, this page, the person sitting next to you, as inherently valuable, inherently consequential, and worthy of the full attention of our perceptual faculties for its own sake, and not in mercenary greed as an instrument towards some deferred reward. Poetry is an art form especially suited to a theology that posits the eternal value of the material not as some illusory snare, nor as some accident to be transcended, but in its materiality. I was brought up this way. I want significance now, homie, and I want it straight up, imminent, mainline through my senses, and enduring as long as I'm willing to attend to it. The argument I'm making today has governed pretty much all the work I've done with the magnitudinous word. As a critic, as a poet, as a translator, by asserting the presence of presence, poetry makes everything at hand worthy of reverence. To make this point another way, I'll close with a poem from my forthcoming collection, Uncommon Prayer. Book of Hours. A Pentecost of bloom, all the furred tongues a wag in the iris patch, wind rush through the fire flower. To what wonders they may testify, I don't know. My earthy idiom hears as noise the hiss of sweet alyssum and the bee's melisma. Shouldn't that be enough? But I fidget around the garden like a wasp for nectar, greedy, antic, spoiling for the ruin of meaning. One long morning I looked thus at inkwork on trussed vellum, a gospel in cochineal and verdigris, a gold leaf haloing the majuscule. The manuscript twined a black briar, stem and barb from margin to margin. No untangling that liturgy, no telling the prayers in its glittering pigments. Yet I adored each page, and bent to stare so low that my lips touched the serif of an illuminated T. I left the archive chrismed with turmeric. until in the sudden rain, all that I kept of that book washed from me. The spirit's a terse mutter to the flesh's aria. But I'll forget today's ecstasy when the wind dies, forget their honeyed buzz when the bees hive up for evening. Against the stillness of that fast approaching anesthetic dark, I nuzzle the humblest buds to my chin, dust the shyest pistils across my wrist, and when too noiselessly their petals brush my ear, I will declare them from my very lungs, and I will mouth the wind back upon itself, paper white, incarnadine. Thank you.
First, a couple of comments on behalf of our mutual friend Ryan Nesbitt. I'm going to cheer everything you just said. and the G, and I love the G you use and whatever font you chose for this poem draws attention. It made me think about the font, which I suppose is kind of
Baskerville.
Yeah. Anyway, the question I have is about print, because Herbert never saw his poems in print, right? And so what role does print play as a mediated force? I mean, because print is what makes the object available and widely disseminable, right?
Right. I would, first of all, refer you to somebody who's much smarter on print culture of the Renaissance than I am. There's a very good book that came out like 2 years ago by Patrick Kearney called The Incarnate Text, and he talks at length about what happens when particularly theological or exegetical writings get put into print and then disseminated, and how that sort of how the effect of having these objects at hand that deal with theological objects then bounces back or redounds to interpretations of the Bible. So that's not me dodging your question. That's telling you that there's a very good book about this. Herbert, despite the fact that Herbert never saw his poems into print, he did quite assiduously see them into different versions on the page. I would say that for my own purposes and my own interest, the distinctions between the graphic representation of a poem on a page in longhand and the graphic representation of a poem in typesetting are less than significant. Except that Easter Wings is, of course, I mean, he did write it out also in its own. Yes, right, unless you're looking at earlier editions, in which case, or like the Wilcox edition keeps it printed on its side. Yes, so in that case, the printer has obviously made a determination or a decision about the significance of that poem's layout that may in fact be different than what. But I think that this is a problem with the Renaissance, in fact, and it may be why I am loath to engage with questions of printing, because I know that so much that circles around issues of printing in the 16th, 17th century are not could be printers' decisions as opposed to deliberate decisions of the text. So now I'm dodging the question. Right. And his, happily, are totally worth looking at in all their sort of physical glory, right?
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Kim.
Oh, thank you.